Some kids are scared of spiders and clowns. Not me, I was afraid of buttons. Yeah, the kind you find on clothes. And it was all because I watched Coraline. This movie mortified me as a kid. Last year though, I finally mustered up the courage to rewatch Coraline for the first time since I was a child. And I actually love it now. But I definitely don't think kids should be watching this, and I cannot understand what possessed adults into making a movie like this for children. To make my own miniature version of these horrifying dolls, I first created the shape of the body and head. I gave each one a little nose, and after failing at making a mouth, I alternated between two different shades of red to make the pattern for their shirts. With black clay, I gave each doll a skirt, and I poked 2 bent wires into the bottom. I'm going to turn these into their legs later, but for now, I'm flattening blue clay to use for their hair. After shaping the hair, I used some baby oil to soften the clay so that the texture doesn't look too sharp. And then I gave them ears before baking them in the oven. After they had baked, I pulled out the wires, added some E6000 to the ends, and stuck them back into the clay. This will help to make sure they don't fall out. Then I gave them some black and white stripes. To create a raincoat, I cut a triangle out of... I need to learn to read. To create a raincoat, I cut a rectangle out of flattened yellow clay. And with this same clay, I gave them arms and a hood. Now for a few more details, I added hands to the arms, some yellow rain boots to the legs, and a few buttons down the jacket. I put tiny pink bows in their hair, and then with black clay, I made the heavily anticipated buttons. I used some liquid clay to attach them to their faces, and then I baked the dolls again. Once they had cooled, I used brown acrylic paint to give them eyebrows and freckles. Then I gave them a satin coating to seal in the paint and to give the dolls a bit of a sheen. On the topic of Coraline, of course, I have to make the iconic welcome home cake. To make the actual cake part, I mixed brown and white clay together to get a tan color. Then I took a star-shaped frosting tip and I pushed some light pink clay through it. I stretched this clay out to make the rope thinner, and then I twisted it. I had pre-baked the cake base so that I don't have to worry about smushing it, and I stuck the frosting to it using some liquid clay. Then I took more of the pink clay and I combined it with liquid clay to create a creamy frosting. I frosted the top of the cake and I added drips all around the sides. Then to make the decorations on the top of the cake, I wanted to start with those flowers, which I was pretty certain are yellow, but then I realized that they might actually be white and the candles are making them look yellow. I couldn't get a solid answer through Google, so I decided to ask ChatGPT. Again, I didn't really get an answer because I don't think even AI knows the actual color, but I found out that this is not a Tim Burton movie. For years, I blamed this man for traumatizing me, and he had nothing to do with it. Granted, he still traumatized me in other ways, but I'm shocked. Anywho, I just made the flowers yellow, and I placed them all along the outer edge of the cake. For the words, I initially tried rolling out some thin red clay and shaping it into cursive letters with a tiny dotting tool, but it was way too difficult. So instead, I scaled down an image of the icing from the movie and I printed it out. I took a plastic stencil sheet and I cut out a piece. Then I taped the two together. And I made a second one so that I can separate the words and focus on one at a time. I mixed red clay with TLS so that I got a thin mixture that still holds shape. And then I placed it in a small baggie that I'm basically using as a tiny little piping bag. I carefully and very slowly piped out the words by just following the actual image. And I used my needle tool to make any adjustments and wipe away extra icing. Then I removed the printed images and I placed the stencil sheets in the oven to bake the clay. After that, I gently removed them from the plastic and added them to the top of the cake. For the candles, I twisted white and pink clay together. At this point, I had baked the cake, so I used a hand drill to make room for the candles by drilling a small hole into each one. Then I stuck each of the candles into the middle of each flower. And to finish it off, I gave each candle a little yellow flame. Speaking of spooky movies, I really want to make Zero earrings. And he just so happens to be a character from an actual Tim Burton movie. I'm making them using glow-in-the-dark clay. And the first thing I did was make a curved teardrop shape for the head. I cut along the snout portion to make a mouth, and then I took a few pieces of wire and made them squiggly with some pliers. I'm using these to create shape and structure for the ears. Afterwards, I gave them little pumpkin noses. As for the bodies, I used that same clay to make a flowy looking body and tail. Then I placed the pre-baked head on top. And I did the exact same thing to make a second zero. I flattened some red clay and cut out strips to use for collars. I gave each ghost dog 2 elongated eyeballs and then I put them in the oven to bake. After that, I used a super thin paintbrush and some black acrylic paint to color the inside of the mouth. I got some paint on the outside of the snouts, so I let the paint completely dry, and then I took my craft knife and scratched off all the paint that doesn't need to be there. And I used a larger and fluffier paintbrush to dust off the residue. Lastly, I used UV resin to glaze the pieces and make them look super glossy. Next, I wanted to recreate those Snow White poison candy apples. These are really cute and pretty simple to make, and I started by cutting 2 sticks out of a toothpick. Then, with some bright red clay, I took 2 equal amounts, rolled them into balls, and made the bottom part more narrow and flat. I took those sticks that I had cut and I stuck them into each red apple. Then I put both pieces in the oven to bake. In the meantime, I mixed some green clay with translucent liquid Sculpey to get a consistency similar to icing. Once the apples had finished baking and cooling, I used this green mixture to draw out an outline for a skull. And I filled in the remaining top area along with some drips towards the bottom. I baked the 2 pieces one final time, and then I used some white acrylic paint to color the wooden sticks. After the paint dried, I made the apples shiny with gloss glaze. I first saw these images a few years ago, and my immediate thought was that I had to make them miniature. And I'm making the warm scrambled eggs first. For starters, I need to make a small cauldron, and to do that I rolled out some black clay into a pretty thin sheet. I decided to use a miniature jug to create the round shape. So I placed the rolled clay on top and I pressed it tightly around the jug and smoothed it out. With my craft knife, I cut off the extra bits. This milk jug is ceramic, so I placed the entire thing in the oven to fully bake the clay. After it had cooled off, I used my knife to lightly score the clay that was touching the ceramic. And I carefully twisted and pulled the clay until it came off the jug. I placed this piece face down onto some fine sandpaper and I sanded it down just enough to smooth out the edge and make it flat and even. Then, with some more black clay, I rolled out 2 circles. I added some liquid clay to one side of the cauldron, then I pressed one of the circles onto that edge. The liquid clay will act as glue here and it will help these 2 parts stick together. Also, with my needle tool, I blended the raw clay until that seam was no longer there and the 2 shapes looked like they were one cohesive piece. Then I did the exact same thing on the opposite side with my other circle of clay. Afterwards, I used my needle tool to poke out a hole in each of the circles. For the eggs, I mixed yellow and translucent clay together. Then I flattened this clay and chopped it up. I added some TLS to this and I mixed the 2 together slightly so that they are somewhat combined but still lumpy. Then I filled the cauldron up with some scrap clay. This part won't show anyway, so it's helpful to use scrap clay for stuff like this so that you don't have to waste tons of good clay. Then I layered the egg mixture on top. And I used my needle tool to swirl it around and add extra lumpiness. I sprinkled some fine black glitter on top to mimic pepper. Then I baked it in the oven one more time. To make a handle for the cauldron, I took a headpin and cut off the flat end. With my hands, I bent the wire so that it kinda looks like a semicircle. And then I used jewelry pliers to bend each end 90 degrees so that I got this shape. Then I used black nail polish to cover up the wire color. Acrylic paint doesn't easily stick to metal, but nail polish does. And I used some scrap clay to hold up the wire while it dried. Then I painted the other half. Once the whole thing was dry, I placed the wire through the holes of the cauldron. And I used satin glaze to give some dimension to the eggs and a bit of shine to the cauldron itself. Lastly, I used a pen and paper to write out a little sign. And now it's time for the Sprite treats. To make the green bowl, I basically did the exact same thing I did earlier to make the cauldron. And to make the bags of Sprite, I decided to fill up these tiny baggies I have with some UV resin. But after trying to seal the baggie, it just wasn't looking at all like the real thing. It looks too flat, but if I fill it up anymore, it starts spilling everywhere. Also, the bags were a bit too long. So what I ended up doing is using a mini hair straightener to melt the bags. This makes them smaller and it also binds the two sides together. Then I filled these even smaller baggies with some UV resin. And instead of trying to zip them up like I did before, I held the edges open while I cured the resin with a light. I repeated this process 2 more times, and then I placed all 3 bags under a UV lamp for a few minutes just to make sure the resin is fully cured. And finally, in my best dad handwriting, I wrote a sign to ration out the Sprite. Thank you so much for watching. Full disclosure, some of these were made and filmed last year, I just never posted them, cause again, that whole not feeling good enough thing. All the earrings in this video were made a year ago, obviously. I learned from the last video not to make earrings. Bad idea for me, at least for now. Speaking of my last video, I want to thank you guys for responding so kindly to it. I always get comments pointing out my upload schedule or lack thereof, so I felt like I needed to explain it. And I was kind of worried about adding that last part because I don't want to be sappy or negative. I want my videos to be fun and lighthearted, so I was a bit afraid, but you all were so sweet about it and your comments made me feel a lot better, and I really appreciate you guys. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next video.